for a muse of fire that would ascend the brightest heaven of invention, a kingdom for a stage, princes to act, and monarchs to behold the swelling scene. Then should the warlike Harry, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's, our very own Muse of Fire, the inaugural Sir Charles Nicholson Lecture. I'm Matthew Gibbs, I'm the President of the Friends, and it is my great pleasure to say hello to each of you. Now, to begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, indeed the land upon which Sydney University is built, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. As we share our own knowledge and stories and teaching tonight, we pay respect to the knowledge embedded within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. Tonight too, of course, we honour the man after whom the museum is named and whose donations form the basis of the marvellous collection that we all so thoroughly enjoy. I'm talking, of course, about Sir Charles Nicholson. The Friends, and I trust most of you are friends of the Nicholson, are very proud to sponsor this first Nicholson Lecture, and we do hope that it will become an annual event. It will certainly serve as a very meaningful way to preserve and to celebrate Sir Charles Nicholson's name after we move to the new Chow Chak Wing Museum in a couple of years' time. And there, of course, those lectures will be surrounded by even more of the collection because of the greater space available to display the wonderful things that the museum holds. Tonight's lecture also helps us, the Friends, fulfil our obligation to ensure that the legacy of Sir Charles Nicholson and the Nicholson name is kept going for future generations. And again, I'd like to thank you, this present generation, for your dedication to that same task, both by being a friend of the Nicholson and also for attending this evening. Now, of course, it's also soon the season to be jolly. So tonight is also serving as the end-of-year Christmas come early party for the Friends. I think it's true to say already, a month and a half out, that it has been a year of rising attendances and certainly some outstanding experiences. So if you do find yourself under any mistletoe this evening, early as it is, I think that we can give you permission, with the person's consent, to offer a kiss to the nearest friend next to you. But we are very delighted to have tonight as our inaugural deliverer of the Sir Charles Nicholson Lecture, called, of course, Facing Our Past, the Jericho Skull. It's Dr Alexandra Fletcher from the British Museum. And Dr Fletcher will be discussing her research into the British Museum's own 9,500-year-old plastered Jericho Skull. We, of course, at the Nicholson have our own Jericho Skull. Priceless treasures indeed they are. And surely the Jericho Skull is the most famous noggin in the world other than Yorick's. So anyway, alas poor Yorick, but happy for us. Let's get on with tonight's swelling scene. Please make welcome our Senior Curator of the Nicholson Museum, Dr Jamie Fraser.
Oh, thank you very much, Matthew. We did consider putting mistletoe over the statue of Hermes, but unfortunately collections management vetoed the idea. I will shortly introduce Dr Fletcher as the speaker tonight, just to underline Matthew's comments that this is the inaugural annual Nicholson Lecture. We really do hope to continue moving this as an annual feature of our public programs as we continue into the Chow Chak Wing Museum. And in particular, why we've created this with the Friends of the Nicholson is to bring to Sydney, to the Nicholson Museum, a museum professional from somewhere else who is doing research that is relevant to what we have here in Sydney and who can bring fresh eyes onto something that we have in our collection. And that's quite important because we get a lot of ancient historians, archaeologists, modern historians passing through Sydney University, giving a lot of their time and their research. But we want to do something particular to the museums and to bring over a museum professional. And here I think we have in Dr Alexandra Fletcher the perfect speaker for our inaugural lecture series. The Jericho Skull is one of the oldest objects we have in our collection, and I think it's a nice one to start this annual lecture with by going back 9,500 years ago. Now, Dr Fletcher did her PhD in the University of Manchester. She's been working as a curator at the British Museum in the Middle East Department since 2001, and you may well have seen her when she did some CT scanning of the Jericho Skull in the British Museum a few years ago, which then went on to act as a standalone exhibition in the Room 3 Temporary Gallery, just on the Jericho Skull itself. And that hit headlines across the world. We're actually going to be CT scanning our Jericho Skull here in Sydney at Macquarie Medical Imaging tomorrow, so it's all very exciting. And the sorts of research and the images that you will see here tonight with Alexandra is really the sorts of research we hope to build upon on the Nicholson Jericho Skull itself, and then use that to form a new exhibition with the Jericho Skull in the Chowchak Wing Museum. Sally, or Alexandra, will bring very new eyes onto this most ancient of objects here tonight. Now, I could read out the rest of Alexandra's bio, but what I'll do is just skip to the last paragraph that she sent, where she said, "Clearly this omits my valuable skills in dog wrangling, drying washing so I don't have to iron it, making the best chocolate sauce, teleporting to appear to be in 3 places at once, keeping a straight face when children sing, and generally winging it." Now, I know she's not winging it tonight because she's put an awful lot of research into this Jericho Skull, and I'm so pleased we're able to have her here in Sydney to share this with us for the annual Nicholson Lecture. Please welcome Dr Alexandra Fletcher.
Well, thank you very much for those lovely introductions, and thank you very much for inviting me to come here to Sydney, to your beautiful city. It's been a great honour and a great pleasure to come here and visit you all. And so, on to the Jericho Skull. So, I called this lecture Facing Our Past, because this research is completely about finding the person within these otherwise very enigmatic constructions of plaster faces over genuine human skulls. And it's part of a tradition of respecting the dead that we, as archaeologists, think might have held ancient communities together. Skulls were selected, they were cleaned, and they were decorated. But it's not entirely clear why certain people were chosen for this treatment, and that's been something that I've been trying to get to as part of my work. The worn state of many of the skulls, you can see the image on the screen here in front of us, it looks quite tired, I have to say, and their generally worn out state suggests that they were used for very long periods of time, probably by several generations. And as time passed, there is a feeling that perhaps they may have worked as ancestor figures for the whole community to share. So for the example that we have in the British Museum, finding out more about the person beneath the plaster without causing any damage. I mean, the obvious way to proceed with a conundrum like this would be to completely remove the plaster face so that you could get to the human bone underneath. But that doesn't really work if we stop and think about it. So we had to be much more inventive in how we did our research and use some very innovative scientific techniques. But before we get into all of that, let's just remind ourselves where in the world we are going to be. Jericho is located to the north of the Dead Sea. It's an area now known as the Palestinian Authority. which is here. And archaeologists like to call this whole area the Levant, which actually means where the sun rises. It feels very cheeky saying that in a country where clearly the sun rises before it does in the Levant, but never mind. The site of Jericho claims to be the world's oldest continually occupied town, and it is writ large on the signs that you see around the city. World's oldest city. This sign is still there. This was a photograph taken in the 1950s by one of the archaeologists working at Jericho. It's now in a slightly more decrepit state, but it's still there. Excavations have revealed that people have been living at the site since the end of the Ice Age, which is around about 12,000 years ago. And the layers of building do indeed stretch all the way back from the modern day into the early Neolithic period, which we're going to be talking about tonight, and back into times when hunter-gatherer groups first started to settle down and lead more settled lives. And they probably chose Jericho because of the springs there. The Ain es Sultan spring, which is at the foot of the mound where the ancient occupation is, it still produces around 4,500 litres of water every minute of every day. So it's a really valuable, reliable source of water in an otherwise rather arid Jordan Valley. I love this image of the site. It's before the cable car was built, which slightly spoils the air photographs that are more recent. So just to orient you, this is actually the site of Tel es Sultan, ancient Jericho. It's been created by layers of occupation building up on top of each other, and you can really clearly see the remains of the trenches that were put in by Kathleen Kenyon, who we're going to be talking about tonight. Really deep one here at one end of the mound, one in the middle, one in the top. And you can see how the modern town of Jericho stretches away but comes right up to the edge of the ancient site. This is a plan showing you the different phases of excavation conducted on the site. We're going to be concentrating on the excavations done by Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s, but she built on the work of others, notably Garstang, who was at the University of Liverpool, and you can see there is quite a mess of trenches going on. The one that we're going to be most interested in is this one up in the top here, which Kenyon dug in her early seasons, building on the work of Garstang that had gone before. So she cheated a little bit. Somebody had already dug a big hole and she kept digging it. So before we launch off into the archaeology, it's worth just having a little look at who Kathleen Kenyon was. She was actually the daughter of Frederick Kenyon, who was the director of the British Museum. So Kathleen, bless her little cotton socks, got to grow up in the British Museum because the director of the museum gets to live there. He still does. He has a house in the museum, and that's where she grew up. And here she is as a young woman up here at the top, just about to head out to work on the excavations of Great Zimbabwe in East Africa, which was her first archaeological gig, and she went as the photographer. And after that, she had an illustrious career working with Mortimer and Tessa Wheeler in a Romano-British settlement in St Albans, which is about 20 miles north of London. But she was also digging in Samaria, in the British-mandated territory of Palestine as it was then. So she was doing summers in the UK digging on British sites and winters out in the warm in the Middle East. And she went through the 1930s, 40s and parts of the 50s working at all these different sites. She got through World War II working for the Red Cross. She helped to set up the University College London's Institute of Archaeology, which you see here. You can see here's Kathleen Kenyon on the end. This guy here is Max Mallow, who anybody that was at the master classes yesterday will have heard probably far too much about. I like to moan about Max Mallow, and he annoys me. This, of course, is Gordon Child in the middle, and various other illustrious figures that were setting up the Institute of Archaeology. And she started working at Jericho in 1952, and she excavated there until 1958. And the groundbreaking discoveries that she made there about the Neolithic made her world famous, and it established a lasting legacy in the archaeology of the Levant. Her main legacy was about her ideas around ceramic analysis and excavation techniques. She was trained, as I said, by the Wheelers in this technique, this box method of excavation. This is the best picture I could find to illustrate what a box method of excavation is. Basically, you leave these strips of earth in place and you take out the squares inside, and that leaves you with sections that you can then have a record of everything you've taken out as you go, and it makes it very easy to plot it out, and it all looks very neat and tidy. That's the theory anyway. The problem was for Kenyon, however, is that she tended to stick to quite narrow trenches, and this system combined with a deep narrow trench actually has made it a little bit difficult for subsequent archaeologists to have ideas about functions and features that are across the site. So it's not without its flaws, but she was groundbreaking for her time. So each spring, from 1952 until 1958, there was a team of archaeologists digging at Jericho. They had a house, and Kenyon and her friends stayed in the house, and the rest of the diggers, the hoi polloi if you like, got the tents next to the spring, which were apparently hideously damp because they were next to the spring. And they dug enormously deep trenches through the site, rigidly sticking to her box method of excavation. You wouldn't do this today. Health and safety would just have your guts for garters, as it were. But this is perfectly acceptable in the 1950s. And as you can see by in fact, you can still see those trenches on the mound today. The sides were at least relatively stable. One of her really significant discoveries was this tower here. And this dates to around about 9000 BC. You see this little grating in the top here. That leads to a beautifully constructed internal staircase, hugely sophisticated, absolutely fabulous. And this is the so-called Mound of Temptation in the background here. You can just see the cable car coming in there. So, in 1953, I'm going to take you all back, Kenyon and her team faced a dilemma that most archaeologists absolutely dread. Just as they were preparing to return home at the end of the season, one excavator noticed that there was a human skull sticking out from the edge of his trench. And exposed to the weather as it wasn't going to survive until next excavation season, and therefore Kenyon agreed to make an exception. She agreed to dig beyond the boundaries of her very precise grid system. You can hear how I'm weighting my words to try and get across to you just how big a deal this was. And to everyone's surprise, the skull turned out to be not just one skull, but a group of 7, intricately decorated with human faces created in plaster. And they were the first of their kind found by modern archaeologists, and they're now known to be around 9,500 years old. And these are the skulls. These photographs are kept in the archives of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge, where there was a lot of the Jericho archive. And you can just tell, you can just sort of almost feel the despair of the end of season archaeologists. They've packed up all their kit, and this is all they could manage to get. It always happens at the worst possible moment you get the best finds. And I don't think these photographs have been published, largely because they show, can you see how they've chopped straight into the edge of Kenyon's careful box section? So they really did fly in the face of all the rules. And this is a close-up of that one it's just exposed there. And what I'd like to do, further in my efforts to take you back to 1953, is read you a letter that was sent from the expedition photographer who was in Port Said on her way home. She wrote a letter to her friend describing what it was like in those last few days and finding the skulls. So she writes, "The last week of March was spent in packing up, in fearful heat. Various bits of digging were still going on the tell, though the tombs and the main digging had stopped. On the Saturday before Easter, only 3 of us were left. Kay, meaning Kenyon, Peter Parr and myself. After lunch, Peter went up onto the tell and poked at a skull which was visible in his main section. Kay hadn't let him touch it before because it was right in the section, and digging into a section is not good excavation in the Kenyon tradition. Peter went over to where Kay was drawing a section by the big neo wall and told her he thought he'd better try and get the skull out now the section was drawn. It was a bit too obvious and was unlikely to be there next year. About 4:30, I went up to see how he was getting on, and he's exposed one side of the face, working with a small, sharp implement, like something the dentist pokes one's teeth with. The eye socket was filled with what looked like a dollop of mud brick, and 2 shells formed an eye. Greatly mystified, I went next door to have a natter with Kay and told her about it, and we went back to Peter's Trench and stayed there until the creature came out. Now, this is in good tradition of archaeology. The 2 most senior people on the site stand and watch the more junior person doing all the work. Right. Completely bewildered, we watched Peter clean it up a bit, and then we realised that a layer of plaster had been modelled over the skull, the lower jaw was missing, and the plaster continued underneath, forming a kind of pedestal base, and continued up to the eyebrows. Whatever it was something none of us had ever heard of before, and Kay was dumbfounded. A few minutes' scratching revealed another skull to the left of where the first had been, and we knew that it had to come out too. Peter did most of the excavating. It was too delicate even for a penknife, much less a trowel. The mud brick was as hard as iron. It went on for a week, the longest week I ever remember. We slept and breakfasted at the Winter Palace and lived for the rest of the time on corned beef and sardines. There wasn't a stick of furniture in the house, so we had our meals on the floor. The heat waned and it got cold and rained buckets. We were cold and wet and plastered with mud from head to foot. We had been thrilled at first. But as time wore on, we thought it was all very well making archaeological history, but it could go on too long. See why I wanted to share it with you. At 5:30 p.m. on Easter Sunday, the last skulls were packed up in Kay's underclothes and mine, as all packing material had been used for the general pack, and Operation Parr was over. We sang Auld Lang Syne with clasped hands over the packing cases, packed up the car, and went our several ways. So there you have it, almost from the horse's mouth, how these skulls were discovered. And the best that I can do to bring them all together, all 7 skulls that came out of that cache, into one place, is this image here. You can see we've got various ones. They're now scattered all over the world. This one's in Birmingham, Amman, Oxford, another one from Amman. This one's in Amman too. This one's in London, and this one is in Canada. So, to study them all as a group requires a lot of air travel, which is part of the reason I'm here. You'll notice that your skull, the Nicholson skull, is missing from this image. That was found alongside another one, which is now in Cambridge University in the UK. It was found in 1956. It's very close. I've got in my notes that it was within 10 metres, but Jamie has put on his label in his fabulous new exhibition that it's 6.75. 6.75 metres away. But this separation of these skulls around the world presents some real challenges for their study. It's something that we really need to get working on and move on with. So far, plastered skulls have been found in the southern Levant, down here, there's a group of them here, and up in the sort of northern Levant and southern Turkey. There's a big gap here. I suspect that is not that they don't exist there, it's probably something to do with the fact we haven't found them yet. And you can see examples of more recent finds on the other side of the screen. This is from Tel Aswad, which is here, number 7, and this is Yiftahel, which is over on the coast, around about near where number 10 is. And you can get this idea, if I think those poor archaeologists in 1953 hadn't been right at the end of their season and working in a very deep vertical trench side, these are the kinds of images of how those skulls should have looked as they uncovered them. Nestled together, often the faces facing each other. In general, the shapes of the faces on plastered skulls tend to be low and wide. They have long, wide head shapes. And this may be due to a process known as artificial cranial modification, which is a very, very long word, several words, to describe changing the shape of a head. And I'm going to be talking a bit about that later, so hold that thought. There's no clear patterns as to why people were chosen for this. They're not chosen because they're a particular age or a particular sex, but they have, in general, had their lower jaw removed, which tends to lead to foreshortened faces. So you get this sort of doll-like, chubby-cheeked face when the plaster is put on. But they could still be regarded as a kind of portrait. The jury is slightly out about whether they're supposed to be a realistic representation or not. It's up to you. You can decide. That one's on you. Just to give you an idea of, vague sort of idea of a timeline and just how old these things are, here's our Jericho Skull. In a period known, owing to Kenyon's terminology, as the PPNB, which stands for Pre-Pottery Neolithic B. Of course, she had a pre-pottery Neolithic A as well, and these were defined by basically different building styles at Jericho. And we're gradually filling in the picture around this. She was insistent that there was no pottery at all. We are now pushing the dates for the very earliest pottery way back. There's sites in central Turkey which are now producing what is fired pottery, which overlaps with a period where there's supposed to be no pottery at all. You can see that the settlement beginning at Jericho a little bit further back here. So people have been living at Jericho for a good 1,000 years before the skull cache was made. So you get a sense of the enormous time spans that prehistorians play around with. So I'm always saying casually to people, give or take 500 years. And historians look at me in utter horror. But they have to cope. So just also to give you an idea of how cultures change, this, I don't know if any of you have seen the fantastic National Geographic article about Göbekli Tepe, which is a site in southern Turkey, which has these incredible orthostats carved with these amazing images of animals. That's sort of the kind of benchmark for an early but very formal ritual enclosure. It's a massive site, actually. There's several of these circular temples with these things going on. Then you've got our plaster skulls in here, and then this is a plaster statue from a site called Ain Ghazal, which is coming in a little bit later. So you can see you've got thousands of years with this very interesting ritual activity alongside the gradual settling down of people. People start farming. Comes in very gradually, obviously. Again, we're talking enormous time spans, and Jericho gradually growing into a large town. So the period moving from that PPNA into the PPNB, so from one form of prehistory into another, is marked by a significant increase in stress and population pressure. And you can see that because people start moving into environments which aren't great to live in. They start living in more arid places, so moving away from those guaranteed water sources and spreading out. And we think that some of these ritual practices, so we've talked about the plastered skulls, but we've also got things like the plaster statues and this fantastic stone mask, which is from a site called Nahahima. All of these sorts of objects and the context they were used within, they seem to be associated with mortuary rituals, so burials, and some feasting perhaps. We've got this idea that all this activity was helping to reduce social tension because it was building group identity, creating these ideas around ancestors, places imbued with memory, helping large groups of people to come together and remain together. And you might be wondering why on earth that's so important. But it's actually very hard to live in a big group. And this is where we've turned to anthropology to help us. Because once a population's got bigger than about 300, it splits. It needs to split in order to avoid socioeconomic tensions. Basically, you don't, as a general rule, like your neighbours. And if there's too many of them, you run out of food. So Neolithic Jericho was approaching the kind of size, it's a big settlement for its time, you can see on this graph. It's what this graph is about. Don't be frightened of the graph, it'll only be here for a few minutes. So we've got dates along the bottom here, and site size is going up here, and the red diamonds are sites. And Jericho's down here, very early, but big. Ain Ghazal's actually bigger as well, which is not a million miles away. And you can see that we're on this trajectory towards big city sites like Uruk, which comes in much later. And so the theory is that these sort of super sites, something else must have been going on to hold the people all in one place, because by the laws of sort of anthropology and people not liking each other very much, they shouldn't exist. So all of these towns needed some kind of social glue to hold them together. And we think that perhaps the plaster skulls are part of that. I think that that social glue may have been something that archaeologists like to call ancestor cult, which is incredibly broadly defined. It's very woolly. It comes in a wide variety of forms. Anthropologists can always find you a different kind of ancestor cult. But they all have something in common in that it's about representations of the dead that exist among the living. Okay? So we, as modern scholarship got into this idea, don't forget these skulls were only found in the 1950s. Kenyon was the first one to ever see something like this. There was this idea that these plaster skulls were to represent very venerated elderly males. But, yes, typical, the blokes get all the good gigs. However, your skull in the Nicholson is not old at all. It's probably a juvenile. And there are other examples of child skulls that have been found that have been plastered. There's one from Turkey, from Koskuyuk. And this suggests that children as well as adults had a significant role in linking living communities with their past. And this diagram is to try and get to the bottom of how a remote ancestor could be used to try and hold a society together. So you would have a burial, and then with time and obviously allowing some processes to clean the skull up a little bit, you might go back to the burial and remove and decorate the skull and then display or use it. And then finally, when you feel it's got to the end of its life and its use, you would afford it a final reburial in a group or cache. And I've just put, 4 arrows on the board like that and casually run through it. But we're looking at a process that probably took hundreds of years and several generations. So you've got to imagine a nice big time span around that. But these activities subsumed individual identities. It encouraged the development of belief systems that cut across household and kin and developed a community's sense of a shared history in time and space. And this would restrict sources of tension, such as hereditary power or authority. So it's a little bit like the difference between an individual coffin marker, where we know exactly who this person is. They belong to their family and their family only, and maybe the slightly wider circle of friends and acquaintances, but nobody else. It's the difference between that very specific person and a generalised person for the whole community. And this is the tomb of the unknown warrior in Westminster Abbey in London, buried as a memorial for all those that gave their lives in war. And you can see how that moves from a very specific individual into still an individual, but meaning so much more than just that individual. And I think that's the kind of process that is going on with these plastered skulls. So our reassessment of the Jericho Skull in London started with a very, very detailed study of its physical anthropology, and I was helped by two very, very lovely colleagues whose names are up here on the board, one of whom is based in the Natural History Museum in London and one from the University of Liverpool. And they had a jolly good look at the skull. And they came to the conclusion that the state of fusion of the bones that you see here, the lines that go around the skull, those little squiggly lines you see on skulls, those are known as sutures, and they were closed up enough to suggest that the individual was aged over 45, which for the time is relatively old. But they were desperate to work out if this was a man or a woman, and they couldn't get anywhere with it at all. There wasn't enough to see because the plaster is covering some of the features they would need to make that decision. They also picked up that there is a depressed fracture above the eye. Here, can you see that? And it's got these radiating cracks coming out of it. That means that it happened on fresh bone. So this fracture happened either at the point of death or almost immediately after it. It may not have been the cause of death, but it happened at that moment in this person's life. So to find out more, we needed a technique that wasn't going to damage the skull or the plaster face, as I said, right at the start. And we wanted to see what was going on underneath, and we started with X-rays. And you can see from this image here, our success was almost nil. We managed to produce an extremely good impression of a pumpkin on Halloween and could find out very little from it. Here is the skull in our X-ray lab at the British Museum. Here's its X-ray plate behind it. It's about to be zapped with the beams, and this is what we got. And we all shook our heads in despair and decided we needed to do something else. Now, the reason this was such a washout is that plaster and bone have something called very similar radio opacity, which means to an X-ray they look the same. Plus, the skull is absolutely filled with soil, and the whole thing, trying to get that into one 2D image on an X-ray plate, it just is just I mean, we were foolish to even try, but we had to do this to prove that we needed something more expensive to happen. You can see the difference. This is the skull that's curated by the museum in Birmingham, found in the same cache as the London one, and this has no soil inside it. And you can see you can get a beautiful X-ray out of it. It took us 2 minutes. It was fabulous, easy peasy. And that's the enormous difference. But we couldn't get an image like that at all. And so we got this. This is a micro-CT scanner. It's based in the Natural History Museum in London. It's a very, very sophisticated bit of kit which allowed us to look right inside the Jericho Skull brilliantly. It's a really high-resolution scanner. It can determine the difference in materials of fractions of a percent. It's basically brilliant. Less brilliant is the fact that I had to climb inside it to get the skull in. And even less brilliant, I was 6 months pregnant at the time. And as I'm doing it, I'm going, remember I'm pregnant, don't shut the door. But it was fine. But it was because the only person that's allowed to handle the object is the curator. If I had known that, I'd have taken someone else with me. So, what we were really interested in was a couple of features. We wanted to know what was going on with this hole at the back, because we assumed this was Peter Parr back in 1953, not doing his job very well and causing the damage. And we were really interested, can you see, it's very, very slight. There's a tiny dip there. Blink and you'll miss it. We were really interested in what was going on with that because we thought that might just be that head shaping I talked about earlier, that artificial cranial deformation. And we also wanted to know if it was a man or a woman. That question was still going on. So let's start with the hole. The CT scan showed us that we had done poor old Peter Parr a great disservice because this was not accidental damage. Can you see this edge here is very carefully cut and beveled? And then inside you've got this grittier soil here, and then can you see there's a plug of much finer soil here? So what that showed us was the skull, when it was plastered and the face was put on and it was being decorated, was deliberately filled with soil here, and then just to get that last bit at the end, they shoved a plug of something much more clayey in place, just to seal the hole off. And so we looked very carefully again at the soil here, and we found we could actually still see the finger impressions that had been made 9,500 years ago. And that meant that this carefully cut out roundel of bone must once have been put back on. It's just been lost, probably during the use life of the skull itself. So that solved that one for us. We were very surprised by that. We weren't expecting that to come at all. And then the other thing that the CT allowed us to look at was the sequence that the plastering had happened in. You can see here that the base was built up first, and then the sides are wrapped around it, which is one of those nice little details that you can get from this work. But it also showed us that the hole for the spinal column coming up into the skull had been plugged with plaster. So that further confirmed that it had been deliberately filled with soil. It wasn't something that washed in after burial. Now to the question of that funny bump. The CT scan revealed variations in the thickness of the bone on the skull. You can see as you trace the line here, it's squished here, bulges here, squished again there. And that's conclusive evidence that this person underwent head binding, that artificial cranial deformation. And just for comparison, this is a skull from a Neolithic site of Abu Huraira, and you can see the even thickness of the bone all the way around the back of the head here. This skull was actually squashed in the soil. It's got an altered shape, but it still maintains that even thickness of bone at the back there. So this is definitely something that's been imposed artificially on this head. And we're going to be looking at your skull tomorrow, and if we get the same pattern of this narrowing and thinning, we'll be able to confirm that for that individual as well. So how do they do this artificial cranial deformation? Those of a nervous disposition, look away now. So basically you wrap the head up. You can either do it like this, or you can do it like this. And this is one of the skulls from the same cache, and it's got these stripes painted across it. You can see that. And the thought is that perhaps this is showing that this head was once bound in this manner. The rather unfortunate thing is that in order to get it to change someone's head shape, it has to be done while your head is still growing. It has to be done almost from the point that you are born. So you see this is an example of a child from the Congo. It's the Mangbitu people, and they bound heads right up into the 20th century. And you can see how the shape changes as a result of it. It's not painful. It looks really painful, but it's not. It doesn't affect the brain. It doesn't affect your intelligence in any way. It just changes the shape of the bone. And you can see, I've put in the Birmingham example again for you all to see how it's got this very obvious elongated shape. And we picked up that same broadening and thinning in the x-rays for this individual as well. So, but it's much more obvious that this head is not a normal shape than it is with this example that we have in London. And that got us thinking, that if it's not terribly obvious that this person's head shape has been changed, the people who chose to remove the skull from the ground and to decorate it with a plaster face probably knew that this individual had undergone this transformation in their life, and maybe there was some sort of link between physical alteration and social status. And it was really interesting to get this link with a process that has to happen from a very, very early age, because it reinforces that idea that you don't have to be old to be an ancestor. Those child's plastered skulls, and then a process that has to happen from your childhood. CT scan also told us a lot more about the dental health of this individual. You can see on this image here, this is a tooth. It's actually a premolar, one of the ones near the front of your mouth. And this dark space behind it is an abscess. And this is a broken crown. And actually this individual's got 3 teeth looking like that in their upper jaw. So we could conclude something about their life. They must have spent quite long periods in an awful lot of pain, and they may have been dreadfully grumpy as a result. The other really interesting thing about the teeth was that this individual hadn't developed any back molars. Had their front teeth and their premolars, but they were completely missing their big back teeth. And this is a trait. It's not that they're in the jaw and they've just not dropped down. They're just not there at all. And this is a trait that can run in families, not reliably. My mum never got her back teeth, and I've definitely got mine. But it's something that does tend to run in families. So it's interesting to look and see if there's any other examples of it. The other thing that's rather weird about this individual is that they're missing one of their 4 front teeth. You know, you have 4 teeth in the front that you use to sort of slice and bite into things, your incisors. You've got 2 big ones, and then you've got 2 little side ones. Well, this person's missing their little side one on this side, and that is actually their canine, which has moved across to fill the gap. So in summary, they've got really weird teeth. And when we looked at the example in Birmingham, they've got weird teeth too. They're not missing their 2nd molar, but they're missing their 3rd. We've got exactly the same absence of back teeth as our example in the British Museum. And there's also one that's published from a site in Israel that says they've picked up the same pattern. So, the other interesting thing about the Birmingham one, I love this. He's got a really, really oddly shaped top lip. So you see he's got a ski slope. Yeah? His teeth, or her teeth, we don't know, their teeth would be coming straight at you. Right, almost horizontal at their face. You can see this is a normal front here, nice and flat, ski slope. So odd things with teeth is a bit of a recurring theme. Finally, is this a guy or a girl? It's really hard to tell sex without a pelvis, and really you should have that awesome DNA, and we have neither. So this is still a bit of an educated guess. But being able to slice into the head with CT means that we can look at the shape of the palate here, get a really good look at the brow ridge, and this in here is something called a mastoid. And apparently, according to the experts, it's well pneumatized, which means we think this is a bloke. And we have continued thinking that he's a bloke, as you'll see in a moment. So what did we learn? We learnt that the plastered skulls found at Jericho were created from individuals who underwent some kind of physical transformation in their childhood. And in the case of the one in the British Museum, that alteration was very slight, but knowledge of that change may still have influenced their selection for this special process of being plastered and decorated. Other physical traits may also have been important. Like I said, weird things are going on with their teeth. But I think the big thing that I took away from it is that mortuary practices around burial of the dead, are often the starting point for archaeological reconstructions of societies, but the creation of these plastered skulls should actually be looked at in the context of ritual practices that were the concluding point of a process that had already been in operation all of that person's life, which is a different way of thinking about it. And then the Jericho Skull had one more secret to give up. We commissioned a full 3D reconstruction. So we asked some poor colleague in Imperial College London to sit there with the computer and digitally peel off the plaster from the bone. Remember, they look very similar. So we had somebody who's an expert in human bones to do it. He spent a very long time. It took him 3 months. But what that allowed us to then have, now this is where we've got a little bit of jiggery pokery. Hopefully we can get this to play. Here we go. So what that allowed us to do was whiz him around like this. Just going to stop it there. There's your fingerprints, I promised you, from 9,500 years ago. Right in there. You can see them. And that lovely beveled edge to the bone. And then we can take the face off, spin him round. See the detail of the bone inside? It's a really super bit of kit. And our final secret was this. Poor bloke didn't only just have terrible toothache, he had a broken nose, which had healed. So he'd been a bit of a bruiser in his life. And then I decided I wanted to do something else. This is Kim. She's a female that was found as part of another excavation project we've been working on in Turkey. She was found as a severed head, and we reconstructed her face. And she's a young woman, she's about 18, and she looks like this. And I thought, if we've got the data from the Jericho Skull, can we do a facial reconstruction for him? So we took that carefully segmented computer model that I just showed you, and we sent it to a 3D print. And the skull came out. This is what was there, because of course there's no lower jaw. And the facial reconstruction team then added an average jaw taken from data from other Neolithic skeletons from the Middle East. So they created an average jaw for this person and then worked from their skull. And they then built layer upon layer of skin and muscle onto the base in order to find out exactly what he looked like. So we knew he was an older man, we knew that he was a man, and we knew that he was pretty robust. So this is what they came up with, and he finally looks like this. So you're looking at somebody who lived 9,500 years ago, and the really fantastic thing about this technique is that it was originally developed to enable the police to identify unknown human remains. So they would take a skull to the forensics team, they would rebuild the face, they would issue the photograph, and families would come forward identifying their lost loved ones. So we can be very confident that if this man's family were to casually stroll into this lecture theatre now, they would immediately recognise this man. It's quite chilling if you stop and think about it. And Jamie mentioned that we put on an exhibition about him. This is him looking glorious in the gallery in the British Museum. We popped his 3D printed skulls in as well, so people could see exactly how we'd come up with his head. And we made a big fuss about the fact that he could just be any old bloke walking down the street. He'd had all these amazing, weird and wonderful things done to his head as a child, but actually he pretty much looked like Joe Average. And then Joe Average walked in. You should have heard the photographers that took this. They came to my office and went, "You won't believe the picture we've got." I mean, might be a long-lost relative, you never know. So, there we have it. We went from knowing virtually nothing about this individual to knowing quite intimate details about his life, his experience as a child, his broken nose, his terrible toothache, and we were finally able to meet him and see his face. So I'm really hopeful for our work tomorrow. I'm hoping that it's going to reveal lots more about the Nicholson Skull we don't know already, whether that individual experienced the same artificial cranium modification that our guy did. I'd love to look at their teeth. And I think it's a case of watch this space. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Alexandra. Dr. Fletcher has been remarkably generous with her time and her expertise over the last few days. On Tuesday, she offered 2 masterclasses, which was quite a big ask for someone who has just flown across from the other side of the world to come into a collection they've never seen, to rummage through the storeroom with me and say, pick out some objects you want to teach with, and then do 2 hands-on lessons with the friends of the Nicholson Museum who you've never met, and get across something that you know about these artefacts that you've never seen.
When you put it like that, I'd have said no.
Luckily, she was so jet-lagged at this point that she said yes, and did a wonderful job. So in addition to this fantastic lecture you've seen tonight, she's been very giving with her time and expertise to the friends of the Nicholson Museum for those masterclasses as well, something that we will repeat in some various form in the coming year. What you've heard tonight is a really wonderful example of taking an object that has been known in archaeology for several decades, that has caused a huge amount of head scratching and consternation by hundreds of various archaeologists, all writing remarkably erudite papers on it, but really it takes something new to look at it in a new perspective to give a whole lot of new insights and raise a whole bunch of different questions. Alexandra's been able to do that twofold. Firstly, by using CT imagery and modern CT imagery in a remarkably different sort of way to look at and peel back the plaster of these sorts of skulls so we can ask questions about how they're manufactured and questions about who these people were. But really what she hasn't said particularly here, but I'm going to say it, is that a lot of this has come from Alexandra herself. It's Sally sitting down and just thinking it through and asking different questions that other people just simply haven't asked. And archaeology tends to accrete a lot of assumptions and a lot of misperceptions, but it takes somebody coming through, sitting down and going, well, why? And really peeling back the accreted plaster of these misperceptions and assumptions to get a greater truth. And in that, I think we've seen just how wonderful a contribution Alexandra has made to Middle Eastern prehistory on this one issue of our plastered Jericho skulls in the British Museum. Watch this space, as she says, because this is the sort of research that we're trying to showcase in the Chow Chak Wing Museum, and particularly with the Nicholson Jericho skull that we have. So I'm afraid we've got a few gifts for Alexandra to take back to try and really entice her back to Sydney at some point in the future. They don't fit our normal Nicholson bag, so you will recognise that as one of the show bags from the British Museum's latest exhibition in the Scythians. So it is a bit like Coles to Newcastle.
It will be very happy coming back to London.
But I'm sure it will be very happy coming back
Thank you
to
very
London.
much indeed.
Before I ask you to thank Dr Fletcher with me, just because this is our final Nicholson lecture for the year, and particularly because it's our friend's Christmas party, just to underscore publicly how amazingly wonderful our volunteers are. Mm-hmm. We rely so heavily on volunteers to open the front door of the museum every single day who work behind our desk. And at events like these, the people giving you your canapes and sharing your drinks aren't hired caterers. They are archaeology students and volunteers who are giving up their time because they love the Nicholson Museum. So when you go back to the museum, right now there is mince pies and gelato waiting for you back in the galleries, please do take a moment to thank the volunteers, because they are wonderful and without them we could not function. Please thank Dr Fletcher and our volunteers.